At my cabin door stood a beaten child who whispered, "They beaten my mama. She's in too much pain." About her mother left dying in a shack. That's when I realized her father would come for revenge, and I'd have to use every skill I'd learned as a former federal marshal to protect them. The little girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, standing there in the bitter Wyoming wind with bare feet poking through holes in worn boots. Her name was Laura Mae Carter, and the terror in her eyes told me everything I needed to know about what kind of man her father was. Snow whipped around my cabin as I knelt down to her level, my mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had kept me alive through 12 years of hunting the worst criminals the frontier had to offer. "Where's your mama now, child?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer would complicate my carefully constructed quiet life. "At the shack by Miller's Creek," she stammered through chattering teeth. "Papa and his friends, they hurt her real bad. She can't walk. She told me to run and find help, but I don't know nobody else." Miller's Creek. That was Elias Carter's place, and I knew enough about Carter to understand this wasn't a domestic dispute I could ignore. The man had a reputation for violence that extended far beyond his own family. 3 months ago, he'd put 2 men in the hospital during a card game dispute. The sheriff was too scared to arrest him because Carter had half the town's drunks and degenerates on his payroll. What Carter didn't know was that I wasn't just Hollis Miller, the quiet widower who fixed farm equipment and kept to himself. I was former U.S. Marshal Hollis Miller, who'd spent over a decade tracking murderers, bank robbers, and cattle rustlers across 7 territories. I'd retired here after my wife Emma died, seeking peace and isolation. But peace was about to become a luxury I couldn't afford. I brought Laura inside and got her warmed up while my mind cataloged everything I knew about the tactical situation. Carter had approximately 6 men who regularly rode with him, all of them armed and dangerous. They controlled the local saloon and had the sheriff in their pocket through a combination of bribes and intimidation. Most importantly, they had no idea who I really was or what resources I could bring to bear. My cabin sat on 640 acres of carefully chosen land with clear sight lines in every direction. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, which gave me both isolation and defensive advantage. In the hidden cellar beneath my floorboards, I maintained an arsenal that would have impressed a small army. 2 Winchester repeating rifles, a Colt Peacemaker, a sawed-off shotgun, and enough ammunition to hold off a siege. More importantly, I had a telegraph key connected to a wire I'd strung myself, capable of reaching the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne. But first, I had to retrieve Mary Ellen Carter before her injuries became fatal. I bundled Laura in blankets and gave her strict instructions to stay inside no matter what she heard. Then I saddled my horse and rode hard toward Miller's Creek, my mind already working through contingencies. The shack was a dilapidated structure Carter used for his illegal activities, far enough from town that screams wouldn't carry. When I found Mary Ellen, the extent of her injuries triggered a cold fury I hadn't felt since my marshal days. Her face was so swollen I could barely recognize her as human. Both eyes were blackened shut, her lips split and bleeding. Rope burns on her wrists indicated she'd been tied up. Most disturbing were the finger-shaped bruises around her throat, telling me Carter had strangled her to the point of unconsciousness multiple times. "Who are you?" she whispered when I knelt beside her. "Someone who's going to make sure this never happens again," I told her, carefully lifting her into my arms. As I carried her back to my cabin, Mary Ellen's breathing was labored and her pulse weak. She needed medical attention, but the nearest doctor was in town where Carter's influence ran deep. That left me with limited options, all of which would eventually lead to direct confrontation. Back at the cabin, I used field medicine skills learned during my marshal years to treat Mary Ellen's injuries. 3 possibly cracked ribs, severe dehydration, and a concussion that required constant monitoring. While she slept, I sent my first telegraph message to Marshal James Benedict in Cheyenne, my former supervisor and the one man I trusted completely. "James, stop need backup, stop domestic violence, case turned federal. Stop Elias Carter, running illegal operation, Miller Creek, Wyoming. Stop will need warrants and deputies, stop Hollis." His response came within 2 hours. "Bringing 4 deputies, stop arrive, 3 days, stop, document everything, stop. Carter wanted for mail, robbery, Colorado, stop federal jurisdiction, confirmed, stop Benedict. Now, I had confirmation that Carter was already a federal fugitive, which gave me broad authority to act. But 3 days was a long time when dealing with a man who'd already demonstrated willingness to commit murder to protect his secrets. The first sign of trouble came that evening when I spotted riders on the horizon, moving slowly toward my property. Through my field glasses, I counted 4 men, all armed, approaching with the deliberate patience of predators who thought they had cornered easy prey. I quickly moved Mary Ellen and Laura into my hidden cellar, a space I'd constructed with reinforced timber and multiple exit routes. The cellar was stocked with food, water, medical supplies, and weapons, designed to shelter them for up to a week if necessary. Listen to me carefully, I told Mary Ellen, whose consciousness had improved enough for conversation. The men coming here don't know I used to be a federal marshal. They think I'm just a simple farmer. That's going to be their biggest mistake. Mary Ellen's swollen eyes went wide. Marshal? You're really a marshal? Former marshal with current federal authority, I corrected. Your husband is wanted for federal crimes. That means I can arrest him legally, and anyone who interferes with that arrest becomes a federal criminal themselves. The psychological impact was immediate. For the first time since I'd found her, Mary Ellen's face showed something other than fear and pain, hope. The kind of hope that comes from realizing you're no longer helpless. Outside, Carter's voice echoed across the snow. Miller, we know you got my wife in there. Send her out and maybe we don't burn your place down. I stepped onto my porch with my Winchester in clear view, my bearing automatically shifting to the command presence that had intimidated criminals across the frontier. Elias Carter, you are wanted on federal charges for mail robbery in Colorado territory. Any man riding with you becomes an accessory after the fact. The silence that followed told me my words had hit their mark. Carter's men shifted nervously in their saddles, suddenly realizing this wasn't the simple intimidation mission they'd signed up for. Carter himself tried to bluster. You're bluffing. Ain't no federal marshal in these parts. Former Deputy U.S. Marshal Hollis Miller, commissioned 1867, retired 1879. I called back. Currently operating under emergency federal authority. I have documentation of your crimes and a telegraph connection to the marshal's office in Cheyenne. Backup is already en route. Now Carter's men were actively murmuring among themselves. The smart ones were calculating whether their loyalty to Carter was worth facing federal prison time. The stupid ones were fingering their weapons, which made them the most dangerous. You got 30 seconds to ride away. I continued, my voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd given this ultimatum dozens of times before. Anyone still on my property after that gets treated as a federal criminal. 2 of Carter's men immediately wheeled their horses and rode off into the darkness. The third hesitated, looked at Carter, then followed his companions. That left Carter alone, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. A crowd gave him courage. Isolation would make him reckless. This ain't over, Miller! Carter screamed, but his voice cracked with the realization that his advantage had evaporated. She's my wife! I'll get the law involved. You want to involve the law? I stepped down from the porch, my rifle ready. Let's talk law. Attempted murder, aggravated assault, kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and those are just the charges related to your wife. Want me to list your other federal crimes? Carter went for his gun. 12 years as a federal marshal had given me reflexes that still operated at the highest level. My Winchester was aimed and fired before Carter's pistol cleared leather. The shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle into the snow. He writhed on the ground, cursing and bleeding, his gun arm useless. You shot me. You can't just shoot a man. I can when he draws on a federal officer in the performance of his duties. I replied calmly, keeping my rifle trained on him. Consider yourself under arrest. I dragged Carter into my cabin and used rope to secure him to a chair, then tended his wound with enough medical attention to keep him alive for trial. The bullet had shattered his shoulder blade but missed major arteries. He'd lived to face justice, which was more mercy than he'd shown his victims. With Carter neutralized, I brought Mary Ellen and Laura up from the cellar. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. Laura ran to me and hugged my leg, while Mary Ellen stared at her bound husband with an expression I'd seen before on the faces of victims when their tormentors were finally brought to justice. "Is it really over?" she asked. "The immediate danger is over," I confirmed. "Federal deputies will be here in 2 days to transport him to Denver for trial. The mail robbery charge alone carries a minimum 20-year sentence." Carter snarled from his chair. "You think this changes anything? Even if you send me to prison, I got friends who'll make sure you pay for this." That was his second biggest mistake of the night, making threats against a federal officer in front of witnesses. Over the next 2 days, I used my telegraph to coordinate with Marshal Benedict and document everything about Carter's criminal operation. It turned out his illegal activities were far more extensive than I'd initially realized. The mail robbery was just one of 7 federal crimes he'd committed over the past 3 years. Benedict confirmed that taking Carter alive would break open a conspiracy involving corrupt officials in 3 territories. More importantly, Mary Ellen began to understand that her nightmare was truly ending. Federal marshals didn't just arrest criminals and walk away. They built cases methodically, ensuring convictions that stuck. Carter wouldn't be back to threaten her or Laura ever again. When Benedict arrived with his deputies, he brought news that Carter's remaining associates had been rounded up across the territory. The conspiracy had unraveled quickly once the federal government got involved. "You did good work here, Hollis," Benedict said as they loaded Carter into a prisoner transport wagon. "Ever think about coming back to active duty?" I looked at Mary Ellen and Laura, who were standing together on my porch, no longer as victims, but as survivors ready to build new lives. "I think I'm exactly where I need to be." 6 months later, Laura called me. "Papa." For the first time when Mary Ellen and I were married by the circuit judge, Carter received a 30-year sentence in federal prison after pleading guilty to avoid the death penalty for his other crimes. We turned my isolated cabin into a refuge for other battered families, using my law enforcement connections to coordinate with federal authorities when local officials proved corrupt or incompetent. Mary Ellen's courage in testifying against Carter became legendary among other women facing similar situations. The little girl who once stood at my door in terror grew up to become a teacher who specialized in helping traumatized children. She never forgot that sometimes the difference between survival and destruction comes down to one person courageous enough to stand between predators and their victims. And sometimes that person is exactly who you'd least expect until the moment you need them most.